All right, we are now going to turn our attention to the late 19th century and some developments with the American South, which, of course, in the antebellum years had been a place that had a almost exclusively agricultural focus. After Reconstruction, the Civil War, and etc., there began to be an intellectual movement to modernize the South. A lot of people in the South, a lot of intellectuals, a lot of politicians, a lot of business people felt that, for one thing, they could not compete with other regions if they maintained a strictly agricultural focus, and they felt like a lot of people in the country were looking down on them, had looked down on them for some time. So you saw the development of this ideal of the New South, which was a term that was introduced by Henry Grady, a journalist, in the Atlanta Constitution, basically saying the South needed to become modern and industrialized. There was also a general movement to connect the South to the broader world and to classical culture, particularly the city of Nashville. During this time period, the 1880s and especially the 1890s, started making efforts to do this sort of thing. They hosted a national science conference that brought scientists from around the country, and they also started promoting themselves as the Athens of the South, the classical embodiment of the Greeks in the American South. So, in keeping with that, around the time of the state's centennial in 1896, in a park that came to be known as Centennial Park, the city constructed a building that was an exact replica of the Parthenon in Greece. If you've ever been there and seen that and wondered why on earth is there an exact replica of the Parthenon in Nashville, Tennessee, that's the reason. They were trying to associate themselves with Athens. Actually, almost exactly 100 years after that, Nashville took the next step up in the chain of civilization and got an NFL team, which of course is the Tennessee Titans. Why was the name Titans chosen for the Tennessee team? Well, Titans aren't just really big people. There's a lot of really big people on the team, obviously, but Titans in Greek mythology were the predecessors of the Greek gods. And if you've ever noticed, part of the Titans logo looks like a Greek column. So still, there's that effort to associate Nashville with Athens. In addition to things like that, you started to see new industries opening up in the South. For example, coal mining, particularly in this region in Middle Tennessee. There was a lot of coal mining going on. The coal, of course, had been there for a very long time. No one had mined it until the late 19th century, and that's because there were no railroads in this area. Most of the railroads throughout the South were constructed strictly for the purpose of conveying cotton to the harbor cities where it could be shipped overseas, because everything pre-Civil War centered around cotton agriculture. So after the war, actually it was a local Confederate general, George Dibrell of Sparta, who had been present at Appomattox, at Lee's surrender, developed a partnership with some northern investors, which was often how this worked. Local Southerners brought in partners from up north, and they began to pay for the construction of a railroad to come into the area and opening up of coal mines, particularly in the Upper Cumberland around White County, Fentress County, Overton County, the eastern part of Putnam County. There were a lot of coal mines. Before the Civil War, most of the coal mining was done in the northern part of Appalachia in Pennsylvania and Ohio. Also, timber became a big thing in the South. In an industrial fashion, right? A large-scale lumber operations, particularly in the Mississippi Delta. If you've ever been to the Mississippi Delta, we tend to think of it as a very flat place that has a lot of cotton agriculture still today, and that is true. And because of that, we sort of retroactively picture it as having been the same way for all the way back to before the Civil War. We know that Mississippi was a big cotton producer before the Civil War, but not in the Delta area. The Delta area wasn't settled very well until after the Civil War. It was a heavily wooded region, and it was in the late 1800s that the lumber companies came in and for decades really worked at exporting that timber. There's a song by Muddy Waters, a great blues singer from the Mississippi Delta, from Clarksdale, called "Baby Please Don't Go," in which he says, he says, "Baby Please Don't Go down to New Orleans because I love you so. Before I'll be your dog, I'll go back to rolling logs," which was very much a Mississippi Delta thing 100 years ago, cutting down the logs and putting them on the river and rolling them down. So there was that, not just in Mississippi, but throughout the South. Also, the opening of textile mills, which had traditionally been things that existed in the Northeast, especially in New England. In fact, the very first factories built in the United States around 1800 had been in Massachusetts and other places like Rhode Island. However, late 1800s, some of those started moving down to the Appalachian regions, first to North Carolina, then later in the 20th century expanding to other parts of the region. For example, when I was a kid in the 1970s, there were probably 7 or 8 textile factories, or as we called them, shirt factories, in Sparta alone, with even more in Cookeville. In fact, at one point when I was a kid, my mom and my stepfather and most of their brothers and sisters and both of their mothers were working in the shirt factories. Just about everybody worked in the shirt factories for a long time, and that's something that had come south, the companies, of course, wanting to save on labor, beginning in this New South period. Here is a picture of some coal miners. And all of this is leading us to something, but first let me take a moment to discuss what we're talking about when we're talking about Appalachia, also pronounced Appalachia, but if you're from the region, you tend to say Appalachia. The Appalachian mountain chain, as you can see, is a very large mountain chain that runs through a big part of the United States, from all the way up in the southern part of upstate New York, down through Pennsylvania, Ohio, West Virginia, Kentucky, Tennessee, eastern North Carolina, and into the northern parts of Georgia, Alabama, and Mississippi. All that is Appalachia. There are some things that are unique to Appalachian culture. For example, if you are new to the Cookeville area, you've probably heard someone say Yuns. If you're from here, you've probably said Yuns. When I grew up, we all said Yuns. That's why I like to say that Southern Appalachia has the most superior form of the English language, because we have a third-person plural nominative and a third-person plural objective. If y'all want to go, we'll take yins. Anyhow, I always thought that was a Southern thing, but it's not necessarily a Southern thing. When I was 19 years old, 19 or 20, living in New York City in a dorm, one of my roommates was from Western Pennsylvania. And one day I said Yuns, and he got mad at me. He said, "You're not allowed to say that. That's a Pennsylvania word." And I have since discovered that a lot of people in Western Pennsylvania, especially around Pittsburgh, say Yuns, just as we do here in eastern Middle and eastern Tennessee. So it's not really a Southern thing. It's an Appalachian thing. However, there are some cultural stereotypes that are associated with the southern part of this chain and the people who live there that are not necessarily so closely associated with people in Pennsylvania. Which brings us to this image, the image of the hillbilly. This is a stereotype. There are a lot of common elements to people's perception of this stereotype around the country. if I were to ask people, and there's no classroom here, so I can't randomly ask people, but if I were to just ask people in general, what are some of the things you associate with hillbillies? Some of the answers that you get are uneducated, ignorant, lazy. When you ask about the morals of the hillbilly, people will say, well, they don't have any. Immoral or amoral. Frequently intoxicated. As you can see in the picture here, barefoot, not very well clothed. There's always the implication of incest. Not a real pleasant image. And if you are from Southern Appalachia, I'm imagining that in most cases you don't like those types of things being associated with you just because of where you're from. Now, there are some people who embrace that image as part of their culture, but I believe that people who do that oftentimes don't know the origin of the stereotype, and that's what we're going to look at. It is, however, something that persists into the present. In fact, it's the sort of stereotype that for many Americans is one of the few remaining stereotypes it's all right to have, and you have no kind of social censure when you exhibit a belief in those stereotypes. For example, I learned, just within the last couple of years, I'd never known this, I learned that my Aunt Essie, my mom's older sister, had actually gone up to Indiana and lived for a few months when she was 18. I'd never known that. And she told me that while she was there, she had a job as a waitress at a diner. And she quit her job and eventually left the area because she was tired of people coming in, making fun of how she talked, and particularly demanding that she come out from behind the counter so they could see whether she was wearing shoes or not. When I was living in New York in the late 1980s, people, when they discovered I was from Tennessee, would make jokes about when did I learn to wear shoes. In fact, just last year, in one of these classes, I was asking for responses from the students, and one young lady from Pennsylvania, actually, said that she had hesitated to do a campus visit to Tennessee Tech because she had assumed everyone here would look like this and was surprised when they did not. When I was in grad school at the University of Illinois, I'd made a comment to one of my fellow grad students. We were having a discussion about where we were each from, and I had said that my family, on all four of my grandparents' lines, had been in the same region of Tennessee, the Upper Cumberland, since it was open for settlement in 1800. And he said, well, yeah, that explains all the incest. And he wasn't joking. He was serious. I was speechless. Anyhow, these ideas persist. Now, I want you to take a moment and think about famous people that you know of that came from Tennessee before the Civil War, or that are associated with the area. Here are a couple that people immediately mention. Davy Crockett, there's a painting of him, and here is an image of Daniel Boone, who is more associated with Kentucky, but is associated with Tennessee. And then, of course, Fess Parker, who played them both in the exact same outfit. Before the Civil War, people like Davy Crockett, Daniel Boone were celebrated, valorized as heroic, and still are today, right? They were presented as bold and fearless trailblazers. Were they rural people? Yes, they were. Were they presented as ignorant, toothless, barefoot, inbred morons? No, they were not. In fact, there was a common theme in American literature and American culture in the 1820s and 30s and 40s of people from Southern Appalachia as being the most American of people, who had this Scots-Irish lineage, and some people claimed that they had the best aspects of English culture and American